Everyone. Hey, Roberta.
I don't know if to unmute or not, but hello, how are you?
Okay.
Hi, Jennifer.
There's Daniel.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hello. Okay.
Greetings, Rabbi, and everyone else.
Good morning.
Long time no see.
Well, that's because I don't get around much.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Roberto.
Yes.
And Jennifer, your smiling face. I haven't seen it in a while.
The new year is off to a fabulous start.
Hi, Daniel.
Oh, man. One of my favorite memes around is this like poster, and it says, "Dear 2021, I have tried your 7-day trial package, trial effort, trial subscription.
Right.
And I've decided to cancel the rest of the year. I do not want
Yeah.
And the Carishes.
We exist. Hello.
Hey, good morning.
And Marcia and Gordon and Lou.
Yes, all you fellow existences.
That's right. It's all fake news, though. It's kind of in,
If you haven't heard me say Happy New Year yet this year, Happy New Year. If you have heard me say Happy New Year, still Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Hey. All right, I clearly need to turn my volume up because I'm not hearing everybody. So that's a little better. All right. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm ready to get started. I hope you are too. Last time we had the introductory video to this unit with Rabbi Nevins and talked a little bit about what it is we mean when we pray, and a little bit about some of the issues that have led to changes in the Sidurim of our conservative movement. And I want to begin with a story that I heard from the late Rabbi Alan Miller. Now, Rabbi Miller was, for many years, the rabbi at a congregation in New York called the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. And if you're not familiar with that congregation, that's the congregation that was started by Mordecai Kaplan. It is nominally a conservative synagogue, but it's really the flagship synagogue of the Reconstructionist movement. And of course, they had, years ago adopted Rabbi Kaplan's Siddur and maybe a more modern variation on that. And this was probably about 1985. And Rabbi Miller suggested in a session that I attended that most people really didn't know what the original Siddur was. They didn't know what the changes were that had been made by Mordecai Kaplan. And so he suggested, with a straight face to his congregational board, that they should go back to using the Orthodox Siddur until such time as people actually understood what the Orthodox Siddur said and what some of the things were that Kaplan was reacting against, because most people had forgotten all of that. And I wonder if, to some extent, the same isn't true for many of our conservative congregants, even some of our regular worshipers. I mean, we don't know what changes were made in the Sidurim that we used, and certainly those that preceded the ones that we use right now. And so much of our unit today is going to be dealing with the specific texts of the Siddur and the original Siddur, as well as the changes that we made. I misuse the term original Siddur. Let's just say the Siddur that was commonly used in the early 20th century in this country. Okay? Mostly, if not entirely, Orthodox Siddur that was used even in conservative synagogues. Right? So let's take a look at the first text in our unit today, and I'm going to pull it up on the screen. And here we are. This is from the Reform Movement's Pittsburgh Platform, written in 1885. And so some of this is more or less what you would expect from early Reform Judaism. Right? It pays respect to the Bible as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction, and that science today is not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, even though the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age. Okay? And the Mosaic legislation was a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. But today, we accept as binding only its moral laws, maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. In other words, what we all know about the early Reform movement, that it essentially rejected all forms of ritual as binding. Right? And if that wasn't clear enough, the next article says it very directly. It says, we hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influences of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. So forget about kashrut in particular, right? Forget about distinctive Jewish articles of clothing, including such things as a talit or tefillin, right? That these things are detrimental to the spiritual life rather than the other way around. Finally, right, this is the big anti-Zionist statement. We recognize we are no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. Right? So this is the program of the Reform movement at the end of the 19th century, famously expressed by Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of the Hebrew Union College, as saying that Cincinnati is our Jerusalem. Most people today don't, even though Hebrew Union College still has a branch in Cincinnati, Most people don't think of it as Jerusalem, or, maybe it's better than Columbus. I don't know.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I actually have a question. And
Please.
going to this, they talk about what they no longer believe in. What did they believe in?
Well, I think they do express that in some of what they say about the Bible, that that the moral instruction of the Bible remains binding.
Okay,
Right?
thank you.
Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yeah. So yes, Daniel.
What I'm going to follow up on Ronnie's question. But when you take away the things that they want to take away, what's left? I believe I'm trying to find it, but I can't scroll up. Obviously, there was some reference to value system. Okay, taking care of the world is what I think it boils down to. How did they? Was there conversation at that time on how what was left after they taken this away is in any way uniquely Jewish? In other words, like being part of the liberal, progressive, secular intellectualism, which there's nothing wrong with, but that's not the same thing as a way of
Not
Jewish.
religion. Right. So I think, that there's definitely an attachment to the Bible and its moral teachings, right? There's a desire to reform Jewish worship, but not to eliminate it. Okay. So, I don't think it's fair to say that there's nothing religious that's left after early reform does away with all of this. That it's controversial in the degree to which it goes, that goes without saying. Right? And let me expand on that just a little bit. Right? Although this is written in 1885, it has an effect that lasts roughly until 1967. The Six-Day War is a turning point for the Reform community. Until that time, these sentiments in Reform were extremely strong. Many of you who are longtime Houstonians are aware that there was a major split in Congregation Beth Israel over this issue. And that was how Emmanuel came into being, right? A Reformed congregation that was Zionist. But Beth Israel was anti-Zionist, right? It was part of what was then known as, and it still has a very tiny presence and influence, almost no influence in the Jewish community today, what's called the American Council for Judaism. Basically an anti-Zionist group, and if you want to know more about it, you can look on the Wikipedia page, the American Council for Judaism. There were many Reformed congregations throughout the country, and especially in the South and the Midwest, which were directly affiliated with the American Council for Judaism, and they drew their inspiration from that view and from the program that you have right here on the screen, the Pittsburgh Platform. Personal story. I grew up in Oklahoma City, and my family was part of the conservative synagogue. There were two congregations, conservative and Reform, in Oklahoma City. The conservative synagogue, was pretty much like many conservative synagogues at that time. We didn't belong there because my family was an observant family, right? Just the opposite. We were there in spite of the fact that we were not observant. Why did we belong to the conservative synagogue? Because if you were a Zionist, you didn't belong to the Reform movement. In fact, at Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City, until 1967, you could not refer to the state of Israel on the bima.
Oh,
Right? It was
gee.
just it was not accepted. Right? I mean, they accepted it that after 1948 that it existed, but they didn't support it. Right? You could use the word Israel referring to the people of Israel, but not to the state of Israel. And that only changed after 1967. Okay.
Can I ask one more question?
Please,
Rabbi?
please.
What I guess I'm wondering about is what I said earlier was sort of a real high level summary of criticisms or comments about the reform movement that I'm familiar with in my own lifetime. I'm wondering back then in 1885, what was the conventional wisdom, if you will, of non-reform people about the reform movement? What were they saying that they didn't like about it? Were they saying that to me, it's just not sustainable for a people to
Well, you know,
do what they're talking
in
about.
1885, there were hardly any traditional Jews in America. So the landscape was awfully different. It's only in the 1880s that began to change with immigrants from Eastern Europe. And incidentally, it was Reform Jews who recognized that most of those immigrants would not likely be attracted to Reform Judaism, that they wanted something more traditional. And it was those Reform Jews who supported the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which would train rabbis for the congregations that served those Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe and their families and their descendants. So that, that was the landscape that the authors of the Pittsburgh Platform were looking at in 1885. An America where, there had been Jews. There were Jews from the very beginning of the United States of America, although in very small numbers. And then starting in the 1830s or so, many German Jews, many of them already affected by the doctrines of Reform Judaism that had been established in Germany in the 19th century. Those people brought some of those ideas with them, and that was the landscape of American Reform and American Judaism in general, up until about 1885. Okay. Other questions or comments up to here? Okay. So let's go now to Kaplan's prayer book. Kaplan makes it clear that he does not want to rewrite the prayer book entirely. He says, yes, we have to make changes in the content of the prayer book, but to preserve the authority of Jewish tradition, you have to retain the classical framework of the service and adhere to the fundamental teachings of that tradition concerning God, man, and the world, ideas or beliefs in conflict with what have come to be regarded as true or right should be eliminated. Okay? And he says, some people just reinterpret the traditional prayers. They read into the meanings completely at variance with what they meant to those who framed them. And he says, this practice is very dangerous. You're not being honest. He has a roundabout. He doesn't want to say those guys are dishonest. But to violate the principle of forthrightness, basically that's saying you're not being honest. Okay? And to assume that the average worshiper will arrive at them at his own accord is to expect the unattainable. And here he speaks of the average worshiper in the 1940s. He says, our prayers must meet the needs of simple and literal-minded people, even of the young and immature. We dare not take the chance of conveying meanings which do not conform with the best in our religious thinking and feeling. Not that prayers need be prosaic in their literalness, but their figures of speech must have clear and true meanings. People expect a Jewish prayer book to express what a Jew should believe about God, Israel, and the Torah, about the meaning of human life and the destiny of mankind. We must not disappoint them in that. But unless we eliminate from the traditional text statements of beliefs that are untenable and of desires which we do not or should not cherish, we mislead the simple and alienate the sophisticated. The simple will accept the false with the true to the detriment of their spiritual growth. The sophisticated will feel that a Jewish service has little value for people of modern mentality. Rather than leaving such questionable passages to reinterpretation, we should omit or revise them. Okay? So this is Kaplan's philosophy about the prayer book. This is what we need to do. Okay? And we'll give you a specific example of what they did in just a second. Okay? Questions or comments here? All right, then. Let's go to text number 3. Okay? Here's what he says about.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Danny,
Yes,
I do have a question.
please.
Sorry, I was on mute and didn't realize it. So when did Kaplan begin to espouse these philosophies, and what kind of following did he have in those early days?
It's great question. I think he begins to formulate his philosophy about the prayer book in the 1930s, where his most famous work in that time was the book Judaism as a Civilization. And so I think there's material in there about the role of the prayer book and what needs to be done with the prayer book. He's much more specific in what he says in the introduction to his prayer book in 1945. I think that there were a significant percentage, not a big percentage, but a significant percentage of actively involved American Jews who were attracted to this philosophy. I would say probably between 5 and 10% really knew about Kaplan's ideas and took them seriously and to some degree supported his proposals. I know that my father was very much, he was an intellectual, and he had this big Jewish library, and he had all of Kaplan's books. And I'm sure he read them. And I think that he was very attracted to the idea of a kind of a trimmed down Judaism in the way that Kaplan taught a reconstructed Judaism. I'm not clear that he would have been a more regular worshiper if the congregation had instituted the Reconstructionist prayer book. Right? And I think therein lay some of the problem with Reconstructionism, and that the people who regularly worshiped or were inclined to do so, they may not have agreed with everything in the prayer book, but they were willing to wrestle with it and to leave it as it was. Whereas it was the people who didn't daven regularly anyway, who supported changes in a prayer book that they didn't so frequently use. Does that answer your question, Lou?
To a great extent, yes.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you.
that's, I don't usually get to 100%, so I'll take that as success.
I mean, it could be a course in itself. So let's
And
move.
it is. I mean, if you want to have a course on Reconstructionism, that definitely is a year-long course. I'll leave that to the Reconstructionists to teach, or those who may have more sympathy for it. Other questions or comments, muted or otherwise?
Well, I will say that sitting on our one of our bookshelves is the Haggadah I grew up with, which is the new Haggadah. And
Kaplan's Haggadah.
yes, and for my father's last Seder here, we very much pulled it out and used it. And it had a lot of appropriate thoughts for current events, shall we say.
Very timeless.
Yeah.
Well, obviously a lot of what, Kaplan was a great thinker. And even if you disagree with some of what he taught, a lot of his philosophy bears examination and rereading, and certainly a lot of what he had to say about the Jewish condition today remains very important. Right? Anyone else? Okay, so here is Kaplan on the restoration of the sacrificial cult. Okay, so we're going to look at the actual text of the traditional prayer book on this in just a moment. But what you have to know is that the Musaf service in particular on Shabbat and festivals traditionally contains prayers for the restoration of the sacrifices. Right? How Orthodox Jews read those prayers today runs the gamut. There are plenty who definitely support that. There are others who reinterpret it very broadly along some of the lines that we'll see as we go forward here. But here is what Kaplan said. The institution of animal sacrifice was in ancient times the accepted mode of worship, and for centuries Jews prayed for the opportunity to reinstate that in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Instead of the prayers which express that hope, the present text contains the prayer that we may learn to make sacrifices of our resources and energies in behalf of worthy causes, and that a restored Eretz Yisrael may once again inspire us to serve God. Kaplan obviously was a Zionist, okay? And he he wanted to retain the idea that we have a connection to the land of Israel, contra the Pittsburgh Platform and the Reform movement in general up to the 1930s. And he just didn't support the idea of praying for restoration of the sacrifices. And he adds, since the distinctions between Kohen, Levi, and Israelite have always been associated with their respective functions in the temple cult, these distinctions are no longer cogent. All references to them as still playing a part in Jewish life are omitted. As a Levi, I kind of take this personally, but not too much. I don't get too much out of being a Levi. So,
especially if there's not a Kohen around.
yeah. Well, more often if there's no Kohen around. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I mean, Mr. Finkelman. So, yeah, I mean, you and I, we don't get a tremendous amount out of our tribal status, right? But Kaplan's very clear. He says, let's just get rid of those distinctions. There's no longer anything important about that, right? So, there are also those who would say that maybe you honor that history just by maintaining that as part of a person's name and as something that is passed down in the family, even though you're not supporting the restoration of sacrifices. Yes, Lou.
So not related to sacrifices, but related to Kohen in particular, the Pidyon Haben requires a Kohen, I guess requires, I'm not sure if that's the
Yes.
right verb.
Yes.
So do you know if Kaplan's philosophy was to eliminate the Pidyon Haben?
I'm pretty sure it was. I don't, I can't cite you chapter and verse on it, but I'm convinced that Kaplan just, saw no use for that or for any of these distinctions in Jewish life, from here on. Nowadays, it's really a purely symbolic ritual, which, we could talk about whether that still has value another time, right? And I think how we come down on that would have to do with our willingness to reinterpret it as something that still has significant meaning in the way that we treat firstborn sons. Not being a firstborn son, I have no personal experience on that. I think that maybe there's a little bit of pressure that goes with that role. And that eliminating rituals doesn't really change that fact. Okay.
Gordon's had his hand raised. He's just kind of blending in with his photograph in the back, so you might not see it.
Yeah. Gordon, what did you want to share with us?
I wanted to know if in the early 20th century, if the Reformed temples were built facing east, or if that was even given any consideration.
That's a good question, and I really don't know the answer to that. I suspect that some of them deliberately did not face east. I'm sure it was a consideration in the building of, Reformed temples during that period. Everything you do in building a synagogue has a meaning attached to it. And if they wanted to stress that they were not praying for a restoration of Jewish life in Israel, then they were very likely not to have their congregations face east. I hope they didn't face Cincinnati, but maybe.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else, please?
Rabbi,
Yes.
once you remove the prayers for sacrifice and the priestly blessings and whatever else they found objectionable, I guess going back to my original question, what's left? What's left in a service?
Well, you'll see. You'll see, because basically we have done that without necessarily calling direct attention to it. Okay? Let me hold off on that question until after we've looked at the text of the conservative prayer book. Okay? All right. Other questions or comments here? All right, let's go on to number 4. This from the foreword to one of the Sabbath and Festival prayer books. Robert Gordis, who is a great scholar of Bible and taught Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary, was a congregational rabbi in addition to that for probably close to 5 decades. Some of you, by the way, know of Daniel Gordis, who is the grandson of Robert Gordis, right? So just little historical footnote there, right? Here's his comment on this issue. He says, there will naturally be instances where reinterpretation is impossible, and the traditional formulation cannot be made to serve our modern outlook. And such preeminently are the passages dealing concretely with animal sacrifices. So certain passages which appear in the Orthodox prayer book at the beginning of the daily service, such as the ones he refers to here, Ezehu Mekoman, Pitum HaKatoret, or the phrase V'ishe Yisrael. We'll show you where that is in the Siddur in a moment. But Ishe Yisrael means the fire offerings of Israel. That's in the blessing. It begins with Ritzei Hashem Eloheinu. Right? Those passages, he says, can be dropped without injuring the rubric of the service. But don't throw out the Musaf entirely, like Kaplan did, because that would be destroying the entire structure of the traditional liturgy, besides eliminating several valuable ideas and aspirations from the prayer book. Primarily, he says, the Musaf voices our hope for the restoration of Palestine as the homeland of the Jewish people. This is written probably for the 1945 Siddur. Okay, so it's before the state of Israel is founded. But he says that is not all. Also implied in the prayer is the recognition that sacrifice is essential for the fulfillment of all human ideals. Then too, we cherish the hope that Palestine will again become significant, not only for Israel, but for the spiritual life of mankind as a whole. Finally, it is characteristic of Judaism to recall the sacrificial system, which represents a legitimate stage in the evolution of Judaism and religion generally. As Israel Abrahams wrote, this is the virtue of a historical religion. And conservative Judaism was, certainly described itself in its early years as historical, as being faithful to Jewish history. The traces of history are never obliterated. The lower did not perish in the birth of the higher, but persisted. For all these reasons, neither the deletion of the Musaf nor its retention unchanged would satisfy the basic principles of a Jewish prayer book for the modern age. And so the Prayer Book Commission accordingly decided that the basic prayers, Tikanta Shabbat Umipnei Chatainu, we'll see them in a moment, are retained in Musaf as a reminiscence of Israel's glorious or otherwise past by changing the tense of two verbs and a few other minor modifications. Now, by changing the tense of verbs, meaning they, instead of having it as a prayer for the restoration in the future, they describe it as something that happened in the past, right? And then there are other ideas they wish to express, which are embodied in a bakasha, a new prayer that precedes those prayers, and for the sake of variety, in order to interpret the distinctive spirit of the Shabbat and the festivals, two distinct bakashot have been included. Okay, so again, we'll come to that shortly. Right? And before we take comments and questions here, let me look at number 5 with you. This is a more traditional point of view than what Rabbi Gordis recommended from Ben Zion Boxer, who, by the way, ultimately wound up putting out his own prayer book. Right? He was rabbi of a congregation in Forest Hills in Queens for many decades. Yes, he was, you know, he had enough of an audience to warrant publishing his own prayer book. Right? And so here's what he says about this issue. He says, we are resolved to treat the term korbanot as we have come to treat the term avodah. So what are, korbanot means sacrifices. Avodah means worship, but it wasn't always just worship. Originally, avodah referred to the cult of animal sacrifices in the temple, but was later extended to prayer in general. Korban invites a similar treatment. Literally, it means that which is brought before God. Originally, it referred to the animal sacrifice, but the animal sacrifice was only a particularization of a more general objective to express devotion to God. The korban was a token of devotion to God. And so the term is applicable to any act that expresses our devotion to God. There is Boxer's central point, right? So as to eliminating the korbanot, we don't have to do that. He says some of us would prefer a more precise language in prayer, but this is a futile quest. All culture betrays the world of its origin. Changes in concepts are generally expressed through the expansion of the vocabulary expressing them, rather than through the creation of a new terminology. Now, in other words, just accept the fact that korbanot can mean a more general form of sacrifice than the specific sacrifices that were brought in the temple. And I like this last sentence in this paragraph here. It says, we speak of splitting the atom, although the word atom was originally coined to express the indivisible. Okay? So there, it's just all we have to do is reinterpret the language of prayer. Don't be so fixed on the literal meaning of the words, right? If you're going to, and again, rewriting old texts to suit contemporary tastes will disrupt the integrity of our liturgy multiply divisiveness in Jewry, and in the end, prove self-defeating.
Rabbi, can you remind us who wrote this
Ben-Zion Boxer,
in
conservative rabbi, congregational rabbi, by the way, a significant scholar in Jewish mysticism, although he rarely brought that into his teachings in his congregation. I actually spoke to his successor, Jerry Skolnick, who is still around and is about to retire, I think. And he was there as the assistant when Boxer was in his final years as a congregational rabbi.
and when was that?
Boxer-
What year? What year?
That was like the early 80s. And what Rabbi Skolnick told me was that Rabbi Boxer, he was a great admirer of Rav Kook, the chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine, and some of his mystical teachings, and occasionally brought them into his sermons, but never very much overtly mystical. So, he was like a number of conservative rabbis who were scholars of mysticism, but never brought that message and its meaning into their teachings.
What he's describing in this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of just is describing where the conservative movement has landed between Reform, Kaplan, and Heschel.
Yes, I think that's fair. The Reform movement, I mean, the conservative movement, found its natural space in the middle ground. And so either people took Gordis's position, which was, we're going to make some very minor changes just to avoid the idea of praying for the restoration of sacrifices, or they took Boxer's meaning, which was, okay, you can say the same words without necessarily meaning that you want to restore the sacrifices as they were. Okay? And I'm sure, by the way, that there are a lot of Orthodox Jews today who say the prayers without meaning literally that they want to return to, barbecue in the temple.
Can I interject something,
Please.
Rabbi? Yeah,
Please.
I enjoy your presentation, but as an Israeli and knowledge of Hebrew, I also want to explain that the korbanot, yes, we don't have sacrifices now, but the word korban, the root of it in Hebrew is karev, kuf
Yes.
resh bet, which means to come close. So as we say the prayers, it is instead of korbanot, but karev means we come close to God. Just like we used to become close to God using korbanot, the sacrifice. So the word karov means to come close, lehitkarev, karov Hashem.
Yes, which I think supports the position that Rabbi Boxer takes.
Exactly, right.
Okay. Now, just as an aside, let me share with you my own position on this. My understanding is that people saw the ancient temple as the place to meet God. That's as if they were to see God in the temple. That's where they experienced closeness with God, and that the sacrifices were an attempt to achieve that closeness and sometimes a sense of atonement. And that life And that desire gave a certain energy to Jewish life. And I think we have one of the problems that we face in the modern synagogue is that we often lack that kind of energy and that strong desire for closeness with God in the modern synagogue. We may not even see that as possible, right? My position is if we don't see that as possible, then it's not clear how we're going to offer something to future generations. And it may not make that much difference whether you take the Gordis approach or the Boxer approach, but you have to have the goal in mind that whatever this is that we're trying to do in the synagogue, it has to inspire closeness with God. And without that, we're just, having a little tribal party. We may have a tribal party every Shabbat morning or even every morning and every night. But if that's all it is, then it's not enough. So that's my own personal statement on this. So now let's go to number 6. Okay? And here it gives you 3 different versions of the Musaf service so you can understand exactly what it is that we're talking about here. So here is the traditional Siddur in the Art Scroll edition, no less. Okay? And let me outline the key segment for you here. Okay? So here's the prayer about the sacrifices. Vesham, and there in the land of Israel, because it talks about Ta'aleinu v'simcha li'artzenu, bring us up joyfully to our land, v'titainu bigvulenu, plant us within our borders, within its boundaries. Vesham na'aseh lefanecha. There, future tense, we will before you perform at korbanot chovotenu, the obligated sacrifices. Okay? That's future tense. That's a prayer for what we're going to do. Tamidim kasidram musafim kehilchatam, the daily offerings according to their orders, and the additional sacrifices according to their laws. The at Musaf Yom HaShabbat Hazeh, and the Musaf offering, the sacrifice for this Shabbat. The text is different in Festival Amidot, but you get the idea here. The at Musaf Yom HaShabbat Hazeh Na'aseh v'nakriv. Again, future tense. We will perform and we will offer before you lovingly. K'mitzvat ritzonecha, according to the commandment which you desired, as you wrote in the Torah. K'mosh katavta aleinu b'toratecha. Okay? That's the traditional text of the beginning of the Musaf service in this prayer that begins Tikanta Shabbat. Okay? Tikanta Shabbat. That you see in both the Sim Shalom prayer book that we use in the the chapel service and in Lev Shalem. Okay? Now, here you see the text of the 1945 prayer book, edited by Maurice Silverman, This is the one I think that Gordis wrote that introduction for. And so here you see this little bakasha, what is called in English a meditation, although that's not what bakasha means. Bakasha means request. Right? But this bakasha really talks about the spirit of sacrificial devotion, right? Not the bringing of the how deep was their love of thee as they brought thee their offering each Sabbath day. They still used a lot of these and thous in the 1945 prayer book. But this was, an acknowledgement of the love and the desire for closeness that people felt by bringing their offerings in the temple. May we find that in that spirit, but not necessarily by bringing those animals. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Hebrew text of the prayer and what they did with that. In the traditional prayer book, it said, Vatitzavenu. Here it says, Vatitzavem. They were commanded. Not we are commanded, but they were commanded. Okay? So we changed that. And here, instead of na'aseh v'nakriv, they said asu. Right? There, they performed the offerings that were their obligation. Right? So it takes na'aseh, the future, as if to say, we will do that when we restore animal sacrifice, and it changes it. And again, here in the past tense, asu v'hikrivu, they performed and they sacrificed lovingly before you, etc. There are the key words, the key changes in the conservative Siddur. Okay? And then look in the new Siddur, the Siddur Lev Shalem, now used in the sanctuary service. We used it for a while in the chapel service. We went back to the old because, not necessarily because there was a lot of disagreement about the content, but because it just seemed a lot more busy than the Sim Shalom. Okay, so again here you have the past tense, Vatitzavem. It was, they saw it as commanded. Right? Asu v'hikrivu. They performed and they sacrificed lovingly before you. Okay? So that's the text. And there's just, there's this piece, if you if you use this text, it's basically the same text as the one in the 1945 prayer book. But they have an alternate version of this bracha, which is not centered on sacrifices. Let's go down here. Okay. Tikanta Shabbat. Okay. They've basically rewritten this prayer entirely to eliminate reference to sacrifices. So it's may we be led to our land and planted within our borders, wholeness and in peace, singing joyfully with voices of gladness, singing kumbaya, filled with love and friendship, etc. Okay, so totally void of any discussion of sacrifices or prayer regarding them. Okay, I need to stop here, but I'll if there are questions, I'll take them at this point. Okay, we'll see you all next week. Thank you all very much for being here. Jennifer, thank you. See you in a couple of minutes.
Yeshua, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.